Young Turks, Rising Stars in the Caribbean community, Miss Keianna Dixon. She is a startup guru, I'm calling her. Certainly she's helping us to get started on accessing finance from the climate space. And we're so grateful that she's lending her intellectual capital and relationship capital to help us develop our chops in this space. One of the issues Shana has talked about a lot is the fact that impact investment in the Caribbean is not always very attractive. ICS has been talking about this a lot, and Sammy, Dr. Jaja, you know this, for the last 3 years I've been groaning and complaining. Well, my prayers have been answered. We have a young lady who wants to commit some of her time to identify ways in which we can build out an impact investment strategy for the Caribbean to attract impact investment, attract patient capital. And so we're really delighted that we have her with us. So Keianna has assembled an able group of people to run this session. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Ms. Keianna Dixon. Please be advised that this is the third such session she's doing for ICS. She was active in her first week on the session around something to do with oceans, blue economy. Then she came on for the health economy, and she's back now to wrap up her contribution to this marathon Smart Caribbean Brain Fest with bringing on a new crew. And believe me, each time she comes with new people, so you know that she has a wealth of relationships. So she's a rich woman. Keianna Dixon, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nelson. And I have my panelists already on the line, so each of you can turn your videos on now. Thank you for waiting patiently. I'll give you a moment to join.
If you could change your names, if you'd like me to change your name for you, I'd be happy to do that, because I don't want to see for Keianna's. So I start with the gentleman. If you can change your name, if you're having a problem, I'll do it for you. And the two ladies, if you're having a problem, I'll be happy to do it for you.
I'll type in the names for you, Dr. Nelson.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Doing that right now as they join.
Racquel Moses, who's Racquel? Put up your hand, Racquel. Okay, thank you, Racquel. I'll change that.
Okay. Oh, great. We have everyone on. Okay, let's get started. Well, thank you all again for waiting patiently. I'm really excited for this panel. As Dr. Nelson mentioned, my name is Keianna Dixon, and I've been doing this series of events on the Caribbean investment ecosystem in partnership with the ICS. I'm founder and CEO of Keianna Dixon Consulting. I'm based in New York City, and I advise startups on building and scaling to become investor ready. For the panel today, we are going to be discussing access to finance for the climate landscape in the Caribbean. So I have an esteemed panel of experts. Was very happy to secure them for this month. And again, as Dr. Nelson mentioned, this series of events that I have been hosting is part of the wider Smart Caribbean movement that she has spearheaded for the Heritage Month and through ICS. And so the goals for the panel today are several critical things. So one, we're going to describe what it looks like in terms of climate innovation in the Caribbean. So we have an expert here, Racquel Moses, who's the CEO of the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator from Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. Very excited to have her. We're also going to describe what the global climate finance landscape looks like. We have a climate finance expert, Anele Makhwaza, who is the founder and CEO of Igugu Global. And I know that your firm is based in Lagos, Nigeria, Anele, but you might be hailing from South Africa today. So it's really late where she is, really happy that she's able to join, though it's super late. We're also going to be discussing how to attract global investors to the Caribbean. So we have an investor on the line, Vaughn Blake. He's partner of Blue Bear Capital, which is a venture and growth equity venture capital firm, growth equity firm focused on the energy supply chain. And so let's actually just get started now. We've done introductions. I actually want to start with Racquel. So if you could,
Yep.
Yeah, oh, great. Awesome.
Can you hear me?
Great, excellent. And so excited to have you. I would love for you to help us set the stage in terms of what it looks like for climate in the Caribbean, and if you could share your work in the mission and focus of the accelerator.
Sure, I'll try to do all of that really, really quickly. But what we're seeing in terms of the landscape is that it's incredibly active, but we're seeing a lot of activity in the sort of tried and true, lots of work on renewable energy, not a lot of work on adaptation. We did a desk study in about 45% of the cases. We are seeing sufficient progress in terms of how countries are progressing against their nationally determined contributions out of the Paris Agreement. In the other 55% of the cases, we're not seeing as much in terms of the development. But what we are seeing is that there are a number of gaps to be closed. So for example, we took a look at just about 400 projects across the region, and in about 65% of them, the money had not yet been disbursed. And so it means that there is some semblance of access to capital, but it's not necessarily always being mobilized. And I think that speaks to sometimes countries being willing to take on debt, but also sometimes project management and having that project facility to ensure that projects are moving forward as they ought to. So, but it's really very, very exciting. And I think certainly for members of the diaspora, we want to see far more of our Caribbean nationals involved in these deals and getting into investing in the region and participating in the opportunities that exist. In terms of the accelerator and what we do 4 things for countries, and we are a coalition of 26 countries. And we act as a convener and building economies of scale by getting countries to work on projects together. So that creates sometimes projects that are more investment ready because they're sharing best practice, but they're also larger projects rather than smaller projects. We also help bring innovation to the table. So we work with a lot of companies out of Silicon Valley and other innovators across the globe, other accelerators as well, to be able to bring innovation to the table and get projects piloted in the region using new technologies. We bring the private sector to the table. So we like to say that government can focus on policy, but the private sector really should be the implementation arm. So we try to put together public-private partnerships to be able to execute on projects. And then finally, we bring funding to the table. So we put together blended financial portfolios, but we also try and mobilize philanthropic capital from unusual sources to the region to be able to unlock the potential of many of these projects. So those are the things that we do across the region in trying to have, take greater climate action. And we work in a couple of areas: oceans and agriculture and nature-based solutions. We work on renewable energy and energy efficiency, trying to make sure that we are utilizing as many of our natural resources as we have. And we also work on resilience in the region and building our, not just our resilience against climate, but our economic resilience that allows us to be able to address climate change at scale or to rebuild after damage from a storm. And one of our key pieces of work in this fiscal year is to build a climate smart map. So to be able to identify specifically what will it look like when we achieve our goal of building this Caribbean climate smart zone, and what are the steps and milestones, and how do we unlock capital to be able to get to that goal.
Thank you for that detailed overview, Racquel. Can you highlight one example of a project that's currently in the pipeline with the accelerator?
Sure. So some of the projects that we have are confidential until the countries decide to release them. However, there is one project that we're working on to build a blended financial portfolio for renewable energy projects, to either fund the project if it's having difficulty finding funding, or to build additional resilience, and to use this blended financial portfolio so let's say, for example, if the project is looking at doing overhead lines, we can assist in undergrounding at least a part of those lines, because it's several times more expensive to do underground lines versus overhead lines, for example. And we're building that with USAID, IRENA, Caribbean Development Bank, IDB, and a number of the University of the West Indies, the government of Barbados. And so we're putting that together, and we have a pipeline of over 100 projects that we are currently assessing to determine whether or not there's a good fit with the portfolio that we're putting together and the needs of those projects.
Thank you. And you mentioned that you have been working with folks in Silicon Valley. So I know your work is global. How's the Accelerator building that coalition, working with global investors and other experts?
So we're really fortunate in that we are incubated by Virgin, and we've just been spun off into our own entity and been established as a nonprofit. So being incubated by Virgin provides us with a wealth of relationships, and they have been really spectacular in ensuring that we're in the right rooms and we're being introduced into the right people. Yeah, I was going to name somebody that I was engaged with a couple of months back, but I'm not sure if that was under embargo or not. But I mean, thinking about some CEOs of top Fortune 5 companies, for example. So we really have phenomenal access. And what we're trying to do is to match the solutions that they are creating with our environment to ensure that not only do we have ready solutions as soon as they're available, but we are also building our capacity, creating jobs, building our competence, developing our own intellectual property, and layering that on top of the solutions that are being created that are going to be rolled out on a global scale, so that we have some economic skin in the game, that we can make some money off of some of these solutions as well.
Oh, that's excellent. And I'm curious to know, what would you identify in terms of one or two of the biggest opportunities for global investors when they're looking at the climate landscape in the Caribbean? And after this question, I'm going to pivot to the next panelist to kind of tie that in, but I would love to know from your expertise running these, leading that work in the Caribbean.
Sure. At the moment, in terms of readiness, project preparation, and having a very really nicely developed structure, it's renewable energy, and specifically solar. If you are looking to invest in a solar project, there are any number of opportunities across the region. So that is, I would say, if you want easy, then solar is it. But there's a balance between easy and your ability to really cash in. And I think while a lot of people are focused on solar and renewable energy in the region, electric vehicles, I think, is ripe for investment, but it's going to take a lot of work to put the projects together, because we don't have as much competence and we don't have as much experience. And while the business case is overwhelming for renewable energy, especially solar, there is a great business case for electric vehicles, but the data points aren't as refined. So I think that if people are starting to look at potential cash flows in climate adaptation, for example, or electric vehicles, for example, or nature-based solutions, there's a lot of opportunity there if you are willing to put in some work. So we're really excited about the potential that the region is posing in those areas.
Thank you. Excellent. Anele, I would love to pivot to you now with your work leading Igugu Global. And so can you describe more of the mission of your firm and your role in the global finance landscape to start?
Yes, thank you, Keianna. And that's a fantastic point for me to dive in after Racquel's great opening up of the dialogue for us today. Igugu Global is Africa's Green Finance Deal Room. So we say that we bridge the gap between green deal data and transactions in emerging markets. And really, our mission is solving this question of how do we take the economy as we have it today and transition it into something that is low carbon and sustainable. And I think very much in a lot of the points that Racquel hit, from describing the ecosystem that has already been established in the Caribbean, from investors to academics to entrepreneurs. It speaks to the urgency and the exciting moment we have in climate finance as a whole, of creating a new language of value. And really, we believe that Igugu Global is at the vanguard of being the grassroots, bottom-up connection to global financial engine in terms of how we communicate value in finance.
Very nice. And who are some of your biggest partners, the type of organizations that you usually partner with, to add some more context for the audience?
Okay, fantastic. I think maybe just to add a little more context to the question of green finance or climate finance and the conversation today, how we contextualize it at Igugu is that when you look at sort of where the conversation is, there's really two conversations happening. There's one conversation about financing green, so exactly to what many of the points Racquel has referenced around projects in solar or waste energy. But the other half of the dialogue is around greening finance, which is making sure that finance has a language that goes beyond traditional risk and return in assessing projects that are eligible to be financed. So in real terms, now in post-COVID times, for the first time, people are really seriously starting to think global balance sheets are really stressed. We need more than what we've been using up till this point to evaluate how we rebuild, how we define what is sustainable, and how we move forward. So those are really the two lanes of the climate finance conversation. It's financing the climate and then sort of greening how finance views value and transactions and investments altogether. So I don't know whether I've sort of taken us off on a segue, but sort of from that point then, Igugu very much plays on the greening finance and helping banks, investors, and corporates understand the sustainability elements of their portfolios. An example of a space that we play squarely in out of Lagos, Nigeria, is Financial Centers for Sustainability. FC4S is an initiative it was touched on in the prior panel, and I'm sure it will be touched on a bit more in this panel, but is an initiative that came out of the United Nations. Even prior to coming out of the United Nations, it really came out of the G20, the G20 Green Finance Study Group, as they began grappling with this, the urgency of the climate crisis, recognizing that finance has a role to play in solving this, and then asking how do we mobilize and set in place mechanisms that from the top down, and then from an Igugu perspective and Racquel climate finance perspective, mobilizing bottom-up innovation to speak to those global topics. So that would be Financial Centers for Sustainability, of which we're a member.
Oh, thank you. And I think someone in the audience mentioned that they couldn't hear you as well. If you could see if you can turn your mic up a little bit while I jump into the next question. I know that technology is always something that's unpredictable the day of the event. The next question I wanted to ask you, Anele, is, as you set a great context for the global landscape when it comes to finance around climate, can you talk about the experiences that you've had doing work in small island states that are combating climate change, and what is their experience with the ability to access capital and just attract attention from the global community to finance climate projects?
Yeah. Thank you. I think that very much speaks to the purpose of what has gathered all of us here today in the context of Caribbean Heritage Month and small island developing states. Personally, I live in the Seychelles, which is an archipelago of 115 islands in the Indian Ocean, which is where I began my climate finance journey. And in the Seychelles, part of that was for us the road towards assessing projects that would ultimately give the community the confidence to issue the world's first blue bond. In that journey, along the way, the innovations that came with it was the world's first debt for nature swap. So very much within the context of the conversation today, I think it's important to make clear that small island developing states have very much remained at the vanguard of marine protected areas worldwide. And that's a service that they play for the global ecosystem. Because I'm sure there's no more powerful symbol of the world's interconnectedness than the oceans, which is something that is unique to the way people in the Seychelles and small island communities live. So to that end, we have already seen a lot of innovation come out of small island states. The Caribbean in particular, we look at multi-clauses that have really radically changed the way small island states are able to fight for their rights from a climate justice perspective, in terms of what does a fiscal debt mean in the context of the climate crisis, and being able to negotiate to pause those international debt obligations when we do have those. So I think globally at an intergovernmental level, we do very much see the leadership of small island nations claiming space and being at the vanguard. I think probably where Racquel can speak much more to is the gap that comes at the next level then of they've created this space, they've coined the term blue economy. What does that then mean when we roll it back into implementable steps in our own ecosystem? And do we have the capacity to deliver that as we build them out? A point that Racquel spoke to was the 400 projects in a pipeline, funding provisionally approved, but not yet dispersed. When we zero in on the issues of funding projects in small island states, we find that in a lot of this, the intricacies of eligibility are also something that really challenges the ability of entrepreneurs on the ground to innovate, which is why it was great to hear her talk about the entrepreneurial support that an ecosystem that they've been able to build around the players on the ground in the Caribbean in particular.
Are you able to share one success story that you have seen from your work when you were, I know that you're working in Seychelles, but something that might be transferable in terms of lessons for the Caribbean when it comes to a successful arrangement of like an innovative financing project that was really focused on the needs of that island nation?
I think something that is very much on the table for several, not just small island states, even sort of landlocked, or not landlocked, but sort of nations that are continental or on the continent, want to replicate is the debt for nature swap, because that was a very unique transaction where the Nature Conservancy, through dialogue with the government of Seychelles, was able to restructure part of the government debt. And in that restructure, the reduced rate of funding then enabled the island nation to create a trust, and that trust is able to issue grants to entrepreneurs in the blue economy, developing solutions that serve the 115 islands of the Seychelles. So that's an instance where, again, the ecosystem has looked around, assessed what the need is in terms of developing small entrepreneurs, and being able to structure something that benefits the district at a total level.
Great, thank you. I know that I believe is an example of a project in the pipeline in the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator in terms of the debt for nature swap.
And we use that project in the Seychelles as an example of when it goes exactly right. You know, there's so many things and so many projects that you can tie back to that Debt for Nature swap by TNC. And TNC is one of our partners. And so we have 3 Debt for Nature swaps currently on the table that are at various stages of being approved by the countries. But we're really excited about the potential, because the one thing that we have more than water in the region is debt.
Thank you. We're going to jump to Vaughn now. Thank you for waiting. So I would love, Vaughn, if you could describe more about the work of your firm, your work as an investor in the space, just to start. So we could kind of pull that in from the global investor perspective.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, so hi, Racquel, Anele, great to join the panel with you guys. Keianna, thanks for the invite. My name is Vaughn Blake. I'm a general partner at Blue Bear Capital. Blue Bear, what we do is we invest in data-driven technologies across the energy supply chain. So in practice, that sort of means we invest in generally software businesses that optimize, enable, or protect across the sectors of energy infrastructure and climate. Portfolio spans wind, solar, grid, storage, labor and workforce transition, and increasingly we've been looking more and more around the financialization of carbon. And we invest early stage, so seed through Series B, post-revenue companies.
Awesome. And can you share for the audience, how do you usually go about sourcing your deals? I know that you work through a series of partnerships and that you have investments in the US and then other countries. What does that look like in terms of sourcing deals within the landscape around?
Yeah, so I think there are a few different ways that we source. I think just the typical network-driven sourcing, so that's from either existing investments, former entrepreneurs that we've developed relationships with. Corporates are a big source for us. We've got really great relationships with a lot of sort of wind, solar project developers, as well as some of the larger energy companies and utilities. And then I think something that does set us apart a little bit is the provenance of the firm is really operations and venture, and then also energy private equity. So we've got a lot of relationships on the energy private equity side that, sort of a lot of those firms are doing later stage financing, and when they're approached by someone with more of a digital bent or a business that might be less mature, we're usually the first call.
Yeah, thank you. And I would love to, Racquel, when you were speaking about your global collaborations, you're talking about partners and just entities that you've collaborated with in the United States. And so, Vaughn, from your perspective of a US-based firm, I would love for you to share what is the perspective of your firm or just US-based firms when it comes to investment opportunities in the Caribbean, just to give some color into what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's for venture, it's different, right? You've got a variety of asset classes, putting a lot more capital to work. On the development or project side, I think the Caribbean's an incredibly attractive place to invest. There's a lot of growth. There's obviously, just we can tell from this call, a perspective that embraces innovation, that embraces development. On the venture capital side, I mean, broadly speaking, we're software investors really at our core. So we believe great ideas can be built anywhere, and the wonderful thing about a software business is that it can be sort of deployed remotely and globally. So certainly open to our specific, as a firm, our specific mandate is limited to North America and Western Europe. But I think that as long as a business has can reach a large enough market to justify an investment, I don't think that any investor is going to be precluded from looking in the Caribbean or anywhere else. The major part for us, though, is that market size. So and as long as we can justify or at least underwrite to a market size that demonstrates the return profiles that we've promised to our investors, then we would certainly be open to looking in the Caribbean, and I think that any venture investor would.
Keianna, that you raised a really excellent point early on, and I think it just speaks to what Vaughn is talking about. What we are not seeing is we are not seeing enough investors thinking about scale and thinking about scaling globally. So we have some really great ideas, but those ideas are only looking at not even the international market or the regional market. They're looking only at their home country market. And in many instances, that's very, very small. And so if we had an opportunity for the diaspora to lend that sort of perspective, to be able to think about which of these solutions have the ability to achieve global scale or to access the US market, that would be the greatest sort of synergy between what's happening in the region and the diaspora, from my perspective.
Great, great. Thank you. Anele, I want to know if you can jump in on this point, if you have any perspectives when it comes to, I know that you spoke about the successful projects in the Seychelles, and that's already been being replicated within the Caribbean, but from the perspective of, let's say, data and technology and the importance of capturing that information for use cases around climate, for investing, but also what have you seen as like how companies can leverage data and technology for climate solutions to make them attractive for global investors from your perspective working internationally? Since Vaughn mentioned that's one of his kind of focus areas when he's looking at deals.
Okay, I think, thank you for that. I think maybe to come in and open up the conversation a little bit, something that comes to mind when I think of certainly, sorry, the question was.
So I'm curious to know, I know that for your solutions for Google Global,
Yes,
you do work around data in terms of like use cases when it comes to climate finance. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, my mind's constantly on two tracks. I had two, so data, really, really critical point on both sides of the question, right? To the context of this being a small island state conversation, and we're talking about climate and finance, terms that have come out in terms of how we finance climate are green finance and blue economy. So the very question of what is green is a question of data, right? In terms of how the people on the ground, be it St. Lucia or the Micronesia or the Seychelles, define this as a green asset and something that an investor would want to invest in. And then also from the top down, the huge issue from a data perspective is how investors also define and communicate value in terms of what they expect asset managers to be finding and looking for on the ground. So data, huge question on both sides. If you dig a little bit deeper, or not even still scratching the surface as to green bonds, the only thing that makes a green bond green, different from a regular bond, is being able to verify use of funds, that the use of funds for that bond have gone to a sustainable or climate-related initiative. That begs for a whole industry in smart meters to your question of data and verification and being able to show investors that their funds are indeed being directed to the underwater kelp forest that we're hoping to grow in the Caribbean. So data is very, very central to this question, not just data standalone, but the role that we take as people and voices in the global south of defining data. What is green? What is urgent? What is an asset? And then communicating that to investors is very much at the heart of this. So from both sides, it is a data conversation.
Thank you. Vaughn, I'd like to jump back to you when it comes to, so I know we've discussed how your firm looks at deals, sources deals, and did some kind of perspectives around what would make things attractive for the Caribbean. I would like to know, when it comes to your partnerships and other things that lead to sourcing and deals, how do you partner with, maybe from like the venture capital side, smaller companies that are creating innovative solutions, so software ones? Do you package in like advising with that, when it's kind of steering them in the direction of what would make their company scalable? And so I wanted to kind of continue on that topic of data and technology, since that's like a big focus point, I know, for like Anele's work and then your work as well.
For sure. Yeah, we're a pretty concentrated investor in that our portfolio is, it doesn't include a outsized amount of companies. So we get very involved with each company that we invest in, typically early stage venture capital firms, invest in anywhere from 20 to 40 companies per fund. We're a lot smaller, so we invest in 12 companies per fund. We allocate more capital to a fewer number of companies and generally join boards and dive in pretty deeply. The way that we sort of both diligence and qualify our investments is understanding how the business's value proposition has been effective within the marketplace, and then sort of run it through our network of folks, of asset owners. For instance, we have a lot of asset owners that are investors in our fund whose capital we deploy, and basically try and marry technology companies that we meet to optimizing or protecting or bringing additional efficiency to existing, for example, utility scale solar farms or offshore wind developments. And if we see a significant amount of enthusiastic reception on the side of the folks that we've been introducing prospective investment to, then we dig in further, and ultimately, after probably significantly more diligence, choose to invest. And we see our role. There are a lot of different roles that venture capitalists play in the market. Some are great recruiters. Some just really understand how to build a technology team, or can provide insight around certain go-to-market playbooks. What we do is we try and expand customer bases. We try and make introductions and be additive from a revenue perspective. And that's sort of how we've gone about our business thus far, and we're on our second fund now. So hopefully it seems to be working out.
Thank you. And could you share, as an example, one example of, in a general sense, of a deal that you've had in the past where there could be lessons drawn for the Caribbean? So whether on like the venture side or like the corporate side.
Yeah, I think a good example, and I just say this because the impact of the company is global. A company called Shoreline that's in Stavanger, Norway. They use agent-based modeling for scenario planning for offshore wind facilities. So this is a extraordinarily complex build. Well, there's not only the turbines, but the helicopters that get the crew and the crew in and out. The servicing, operations, maintenance, all of those elements, they've essentially digitized and created a way for companies to model around that development and procurement and construction. Very small company that we found a few years back, led the first institutional capital raise into the company, and now they're deployed across the world, from Thailand to Japan to Denmark to the new offshore developments. Every offshore development that's being considered in the United States right now is using that software. So that's just an example of a small team from relatively off the beaten path geographical location. I mean, Norway does have a history in the energy market, so there's something to be said for that. But making a global impact with software, and those are the types of companies that we're very interested in, and I think can be developed anywhere.
Thank you. Racquel, I wanted to pose a question to you when it came to the kind of projects that are in the pipeline there, the accelerator, and what is from what I know right now, like renewables is like an exciting space. You mentioned electric vehicles. What do you see in terms of the proportion of projects or just innovations that are heavily based on data and technology, and that could be highly scalable beyond a given Caribbean country, beyond the region, when it comes to the market size?
So we have 26 active projects in our portfolio, and we, like any other organization, we go through a process of, we have to assess it, then we have to put the deal together, then we have to get the parties to the table, we have to find funding for it, and at the end of it, we will deliver some subset of those projects depending on the deal coming together all the way through the pipeline. But we have one that's based on technology and innovation. And my background is entirely tech. So this breaks my heart entirely. And one of the things that you were talking about earlier with the data. And so I think data is so important. And many times we describe the Caribbean as a data desert because there just isn't enough data available. But we really need to start looking at that as an opportunity. to speak back to Vaughn's point again about the using software to provide solutions that then have the ability to be extended outwards from our region, we can develop innovation around the data collection. And that's part of what we need to be able to do, because once we can do that, then we can create the business case for so many other things, and we can layer so many other things on top of the data. So I think the data problem is definitely sort of the first frontier for us to solve, but we also have a tremendous number of opportunities as well in our digital transformation, and the fortunate piece that we have there is that we get the opportunity to leapfrog, whereas other people would have been making incremental improvements in their sort of delivery systems. We haven't, unfortunately, or certainly not, we haven't made enough incremental progress. So now we have this wide gap, and we can look across the landscape and see, boy, look at, we don't have to spend the money to make all of the mini changes. We can do a big sea change and then, reap a huge amount of benefit from that, and that can help to build our resilience so that there's greater access to resources after post-disaster, because they don't have to follow a traditional method. You don't have to use paper-based systems. You don't have to necessarily send people out with a clipboard walking into the community, and you'll know where people are and be able to serve your communities and right size your response based on the data that you have.
Thank you. I wanted to pull in the conversation now with all three panelists. When it comes to, so Racquel from the perspective of the Caribbean and capacity building in the space, and ultimately it's about economic resilience. So climate resilience, but economic resilience. So Anele, your firm plays like a certain role in this, in the climate space, the climate finance space, and then Vaughn, your firm is a US-based investor that invests globally. How do you see, maybe like starting with Racquel, how do you see your accelerator collaborating with such like US firms like Vaughn's and such firms like Anele? It's just, since we have everyone on the line, we can kind of do some kind of brainstorming right now with just like maybe one thing.
Okay, well, I think in general, we want to just pick Anele's brain. I think there are so many things that we could learn from her that we can apply to the region. So, if she would be willing to give us anything from 5 minutes to 5 hours, we would take it to be able to pick her brain. But I also have a note here, follow up with Vaughn, because we really want to be able to help to, we don't have a venture capital ecosystem in the region, and we absolutely need to figure out how to build that. And we've been talking to a number of different providers about, what are the components that we need to have to be able to build this venture capital ecosystem, because we're just not seeing the pipeline being developed in order to have new solutions, because we just don't have all of the parts together. But the other thing is that I think software is an area where we could really play to our strengths. It doesn't require the same kind of market access as some of the other solutions. And so if we're looking at software solutions, we are incredibly resourceful and innovative as a community and as a system, but we just need to think big enough and to, the biggest problem that I have is not that entrepreneurs want too much money, but they want too little. And all of the funds that are looking to invest, and like, 50,000 to 250,000 is a waste of my time, because the paperwork for that versus 10 million is about the same thing, but the returns are just so much smaller. So we're having now to put little deals together to be able to get to the size of a normal deal in the global market. And so we absolutely need to start looking further. But yes, from a collaboration standpoint, absolutely, without a doubt, I'll take 5 minutes to 5 hours to 5 months if they'll have it.
Vaughn, just any words and responsive perspectives around, and maybe it'll be helpful to know if you have seen in other regions where there was not like a venture capital ecosystem, how did they get started there? When you're thinking of initial collaborations and what the first steps look like.
Yeah, absolutely, Racquel, please. I'm looking forward to having a conversation after this and learning more about the work that you're doing, and being able to provide any sort of advice and support that I can. I think that the best thing about venture right now is that it is a more robustly developed and acceptable form of finance. I think a lot of the problem that even 2 decades ago, a generation ago, it was really just concentrated in one place, and it was a result of that one place really providing the the brain power and the employee feedstock that were the engineers essentially that the companies needed to build the products that were being generated. Now, like I said, software is global. You can launch and deploy an app from anywhere in the world. Data processing is accessible. All of the elements that the cloud is essentially, made. Like, look, we're all over the world right now, for goodness sakes, having this conversation. So I think that having that mindset helps develop the sense of scale needed to attract venture capital. And you've seen again across the country, there's Drive Capital, a Midwestern-focused venture capital firm that's sprung up recently. Loads of folks down in the Southeast corridor. New Orleans is becoming a venture capital community now, or at least a more technology-focused community. So it does take time. It takes oftentimes the best way, and this is the sort of chicken and egg problem, is having someone from that community have outsized success within technology just to start and come back. You can see that Atlassian in Australia, that we've got Atlassian now. You've got Canva that I think just raised at a few $1 billion valuation. That again, that's a restricted island. I mean, it is an island continent that has been able to figure out a way to expose itself and grasp the entire world through deploying software from the cloud. So I think that those are things to keep in mind. And then, figuring out where in the value stack that software layer can be most impactful, drive the most value for your community in the near term too. As projects are developed, across the Caribbean, are there certain software sort of applications or processes that can be developed that can just really help and optimize and engender that development? So there's a kind of a virtuous loop of some type.
Thank you. Anele, I would love for you to share as well from your perspective. Oh,
Thank
sorry.
you.
Dr. Nelson, did you want to say something?
A question I've been trying to ask. My question is around the issue of metrics. I think it was a question that came up a long time ago, this idea of green. What is green? And I've heard a lot about what the system wants and being too small. And part of the whole point of this conversation, I'm so happy, Anele, that you're all the way over in the Seychelles, because I've been following very closely the AOSIS. And I really do want to see a way for all the private sector and civil society in the Alliance of Small Island States to work much closer together in kind of making these definitions, right, and changing the standards. We have adopted a whole series of economic standards that are given to us by the status quo systems. And I think that what is happening right now, sort of from my perspective being in Washington, is that we need to actually agitate to change some of the rules of the game to suit the values of small island states. We're never going to be big enough to, quote unquote, compete with a society that has, 100,000, people in one city, So we have, and yes, I agree, there's some things that we do well that we can export. The same way we exported music or athletes, and concerned do a better job exporting our software design. I don't think those things stop us from doing world-class software that's kind of global. But in general, beyond the software solutions, there are other solutions which are just not going to be big enough. You can't plant enough marsh or enough of a rainforest to be, one island can't do that. So I do think it's worthwhile having a conversation, Anele, and we need to talk about this. Can we construct, because when I reached out to AOSIS, there was not a sort of an uptake on this issue. But I understand, and you might be aware of this, as a new organization of African and Pacific states that's based out of Brussels. And I'm wondering if you have any friends over there that could see if they'd be willing to officially put in place a civil society commission or some version thereof. Because AOSIS has not been responsive and they're based in New York. But we have to have a point of entry that goes beyond training a few young people to do a little bit of fellowships. I mean, that's nice. I'm not knocking it. But it's still like we call nibbling at the edges. It's not a bold solution that's like transformative. And SMART in the Smart Caribbean and the Smart Futures and the Smart Island movement is about sustainable system change. M is about meaningful metrics. A is about agility and adaptability. R is about resilience. And T is about transformative use of technology. And I dare say, if we had a movement led by some of the small island development states saying, hey, these metrics that you're putting don't make any sense to us in the new world order, given that we know the whole economic shebang is falling down. GDP is dead. We buried it this morning. Actually, we saw a tombstone with it in the session in the island to island. So lots of islands are talking about this. And I think we can use the opportunity of COVID to put on the table, what is it when we say green? And there are some investors who are looking at this whole idea of a circular economy, at measuring, as you say, natural solutions, nature-based solutions differently, and looking at the measurements that we use to construct as to what is sustainable. And there's a whole global conversation that's trying to emerge that says, are we talking about growth, growth to become a cancer until we die in the next 50 years? Or are we going to change our metric to be growth that allows us to thrive? And actually, can we thrive without growth? And there's some people who are willing to fund that conversation. And so perhaps we also need to be looking at identifying new people in the patient capital movement, in the circular capital movement, in the new finance movement, that I say, you know what? We can take a 30-year loan on this. We're not looking to make, 15% and pull out. We just want to know that it's a steady drip and the drip does pay back over time. So I just want to put it on the table that I really want to take you up on that question, and let's see if we can move that forward. Because Racquel, my concern is that there's going to be a new season of the day. The development community likes to have flavors of the day, and we always tend to be behind the curveball. And when I look at what's coming on the pike in terms of privatization of data, right, and privatization of weather data, which is already on the table. And then I post something on my Facebook page that, okay, it's time that Africa, the Caribbean, Pacific put together our own constellation of satellites. And somebody called me delusional as about to blow my top. And I'm like, so why must we accept that we have to buy the weather data because Elon Musk floated 42,000 constellations of CubeSats when we have people who know how to build those CubeSats? Right, and have built them already and put them up already, and we have people who are now building these things in Nigeria, in Ghana. What are we waiting for? So we have to change the conversation. So I am basically come to the table with a bold new vision for a constellation of satellites to do disaster resilience. They're going to say I'm crazy, but guess what? It is doable. It's been done, and there's no reason why all the small islands can't come together and run those and be at the front of the agenda and not be like 20 years from now, oh, if only we would have known that they're going to privatize, whether we thought NASA was going to give it to us for free forever. Not if the US government that's in power right now have anything to do with it. So I suggest we think about this new conversation. I'm so happy you're on this call and come up with a new strategy because I have the people ready to design, ready to teach. And by the way, might I add, we're not going to be hiring exporting people to build it. We're going to be training people in the Caribbean how to build it and partnering with maverick countries like a Taiwan, like a New Zealand, to get that stuff up into the air on the rockets that they're putting up. So it's not brain surgery. And we have to come to the table with these systemic change issues as opposed to nib at a particular software project there, software project there. Let's really take this thing to the frontier of the climate change. So by 2050, which is the new, let's say, tipping point here for COP, we can say in 2020, 30 years ago, we didn't know we could have it. Now, instead of Elon Musk having 42,000 CubeSats, we have 42,000 CubeSats up in space, one for each nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. So Anele, I know that some of those questions were directed to you. So if you have any words you want to share, yeah.
I think so many things are coalesced beautifully in just that last statement and the urgency of what needs to be unpacked in this moment if we really are going to catalyze a low carbon and sustainable transition. The urgency around all of us banding together and holding each other and moving forward together in this conversation can't be stressed anymore. Right now, or just to date, in 2020, when you have a BlackRock, the largest asset manager in the world, saying that they're going to raise $1 trillion in sustainable assets in a decade, I think that's really something to be terrified of, because we're already hearing conversation about green asset wars. And if someone says they're going to raise $1 trillion in a decade, the question very much becomes, so who defines that? Who sets the eligibility criteria for the sustainable? And that's where all of our voices are very urgent and needed. So Racquel put it well as well. Just to echo her sentiment, I look forward to us moving forward together in the sense that the great opportunity we see is the bridging of the gap between entrepreneurs, the formal financial markets as we see them, because we don't see transition there in the mid-size check. Racquel said it's the same, raising 10 billion and 100,000, it's the same amount of paperwork. That speaks to a whole nother piece around this aggregation, seeing the small deals that we do see in the islands and being able to rapidly package them and identify them and benchmark and communicate those to them to formal markets in ways that matter to us, without that pre-fitted qualifying criteria of what is green or what is sustainable, what will pass. When I turn to the contribution that Vaughn has made this morning or very late this evening for me, the question of carbon markets, it goes back to this question of what are the assets we're talking about? What are we talking about financing? What is the shift and transition that we're wanting to catalyze? And so at Igugu Global, something that we help banks and investors understand is really the carbon benchmark within their own portfolio as well. So I very much look forward to being able to dig into that because we very much believe that being able to pivot and tilt your portfolio along those lines is something that everyone needs to be able to do as they evaluate time value of money and assets into the future.
Thank you.
Lots to dig into.
No, I love this. And so we're going to be wrapping up soon. I'll give each panelist a chance to have final words. There was one question in the Q&A. Since we were encouraging Q&A, I wanted to just pose that to the panelists. And so I think this is really for Vaughn. Investors are interested in the health of the business they are investing in, as well as growth potential and profitability within the industry. What strategic business applications or development practices do you utilize as you work with startups or existing businesses to drive the balanced scorecard of that business? So I think in some of what you mentioned previously, you touched upon that, but if you had any additional words just in response to that question.
Yeah, I think, Keianna, we had discussed this before. Venture is just it's a very strange form of financing. It's probably the most expensive form of financing for any business or entrepreneur. You're selling a significant portion of your business to other folks repeatedly in order to grow very quickly. So as I think as we had mentioned before, it's only applicable and only works for a very small percentage of businesses. But when it does, the idea of managing that capital efficiency and managing the growth trajectory is pretty much the primary portion of my job on a day-to-day basis. So understanding what you're getting out for what you're putting in and making sure that machine is working and it's not sort of on fire and out of control, where you're essentially diluting yourself too much with each successive round of financing, and also making sure that you're growing fast enough to keep competition away. So that's how I would frame it, I guess. With the timing allotted.
Yeah, well, thank you. And so we're going to head into the final words, but I want to say that this conversation, so each of the panelists, Dr. Nelson's comments is really invigorating, and I'm happy that we started the conversation of how are we collaborating together? How are we resetting the vision when it comes to the Caribbean, but also small island states? And so we're in control of our destinies, but also we're thinking of how can we operate globally? How can we compete globally? And so I wanted to give each panelist a chance to give a few words, final words, before we officially wrap up the panel. So I'll start with you, Racquel, and then we can do Vaughn and then Anele.
Sure. So last year we were fortunate enough that the World Bank put together a meeting of small island states, and it was funny. There were so many things that we were all working on separately that we could, if we're building a platform to sort of evaluate sort of flooding, for example, you only need one such platform, and then you enter your GIS data into that, and we could all share the platform, either share the cost of it, or one person, if you've paid to develop it, then you have some sort of credit with the others. This COVID-19 situation has absolutely exposed how interdependent we are. And as small island developing states, I think it is crucial that we collaborate. And I think that tipping point of that mindset is already happening, going back to Dr. Nelson's comments. So what that does is there are strategic opportunities that will manifest themselves in short order, and the accelerator is certainly poised not only to be on the forefront of that and to be pulling parties together as a part of that, but also to provide that information to get the diaspora involved. So I'm hoping that anyone listening will go to our website, which is caribbeanaccelerator.org, sign up for our newsletter. So when these investment opportunities become available, that you are in the know and you can participate meaningfully in that conversation and participate in our destiny. That is the only thing that we must do. So I'm hopeful that that's the next step for everybody.
Excellent. Thank you. I love that. Vaughn, I'll pass it off to you for your final words.
Yeah, just wanted to thank you for being invited to participate. Looking forward to staying in touch with everyone. I'm sure that you can arrange to obtain my contact information if anybody has any sort of additional questions around venture, around investing in climate in the 2020s.
Thank you. Anele?
I think my closing words, I suppose, would be to echo some of what Dr. Nelson said, by maybe leaving us with a bit of a number, being a finance person. We've spoken about the opportunity around financing climate. The market today for green bonds is at $700 billion. This is the year everybody sees that tipping $1 trillion for the first time. All around us, we see a convergence between sort of concessional, mezzanine, different forms of capital that are coming together to solution climate, be it from public sector or private sector or grant or aid. So I really believe that convergence we're seeing all across finance to meet the urgency of this moment is an opportunity for all of us to come together again and redefine where we go from here. We're looking at a market that's going to grow to $1 trillion this year, but that also sits against the backdrop of a larger impact investing market, where we're saying there's people that care about social justice outcomes broader than climate. And that's a market of $26 trillion of invested capital that is really interested in coming and solving and positively impacting the lives of people on the islands, in small island developing nations and in the global south. So there's just so many ways for us to relook at this Rubik's Cube and unpack sources of value once we come together and stop the repetition and leverage the tools, as Racquel has said. So I think that would be my final word. A lot awaits us.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Racquel Moses, Vaughn Blake, Anele Makhwaza. And I would just like to implore everyone on the line in the diaspora, take each of these panelists up on their invitations to get involved, contact them. Definitely stay alert to the Smart Caribbean Gathering, because we do want to galvanize the diaspora around the re-envisioning of what is the future of the Caribbean. Investing, you could get your equity stake in the Caribbean, people who are Caribbean Americans, et cetera. So don't miss the opportunity. This is the time to act now. So thank you all, panelists. Thank you, Dr. Nelson. We're going to close out now. And again, just continue following the Smart Caribbean Gathering Initiative.
Thank you.
Thank you.